And I'm Dr. Julie Brines, and I'm one of the two faculty in residence for the ACPA Commission for the Global Dimensions of Student Development, also known as CGDSD. On behalf of the International Colloquium Planning Team and the Commission Directorate Board, I would like to welcome you to the first session of our 2026 International Colloquium. This year, we are proud to present a series of 4 webinars as part of the colloquium. Before we get started, I would like to share that here at ACPA, we are invested in the idea of equity, and I would like to share our equity and inclusion statement with you. Please take some time to read and understand ACPA's commitment to equity and inclusion here. And I believe we have a copy. And then Li Xing is going to put that link in the chat as well. Thank you. This year, the colloquium is going to explore the overarching theme of facing uncertainty, global student development in times of fear and change. And we're also very excited to share that our commission is actively recruiting new directorate board members. Involvement in the directorate provides the opportunity for ongoing engagement with colleagues with a shared interest in international education and cross-cultural learning. We have up to 10 open positions, and the application deadline is at 11:59 p.m. Eastern Time on May 15th. And here is a link that you can scan. I think that Lixing is also planning to put the application form link in the chat as well so that you can check that out. We're always very excited to have new members joining the directorate. So today's colloquium session is titled Coloniality of Knowledge in Graduate Education for International Students, and is presented by Dr. Malad Mobali, who is this year's recipient of ACPA's Commission's Excellence in International Research Award. Dr. Mobali, it is my pleasure to welcome you to the colloquium on behalf of the entire commission. The presentation interrogates what it means to take international as an epistemological standpoint and what it means to include perspectives of international students and professionals in the field of higher education and student affairs, and the transformative possibilities of such a project. Dr. Mohobali weaves his personal narrative and examples from research to offer practical implications for thinking about transforming our field, and invites international graduate students and practitioners to engage in this process by speaking back to the field from their standpoint. Dr. Bobali is an assistant professor of educational administration at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln and a current faculty in residence with the commission with me. And his research examines social justice in education and decolonization in higher education and has been published in many leading journals, including the Educational Researcher, Journal of College Student Development, and Globalization, Education, and Societies. Dr. Mohobali will begin in just a moment, but I wanted to go back to the slide really quick and ask that as you join, that you put this information in the chat box so that we can get to know who's here. And I think Lixing can also copy that into the chat so that if new people join, they'll be able to put that information in there. All right, let's go ahead and get started. I'm going to stop sharing my screen, Milan, so that you can share yours.
Perfect. Thank you. Bill, thank you for the introduction, Dr. Brines. I appreciate the kindness, and I appreciate the fact that the Commission has recognized my research for the International Excellence in Research Award. I'm really excited to be a part of this community, and as I would talk through some of my research, you would actually see why this community matters to me and can potentially matter to you. I hope you would see and hear the invitation for joining this wonderful CGDSD community. And I hope you would put your introductions in the chat. And if you also say if you're a student practitioner, that would be lovely. So I would take a look. And as you do that, I would be sharing my screen. Just give me a second. 115, okay. 120, okay. Hey, perfect. Um, Beautiful. Welcome. Okay. I will start my presentation, and I will tell you about the plan that I have for today. It's going to be about 30 to 35 minutes. Please take notes, anything that resonates, any questions you have, any doubts you would have, any kind of reflection would be welcome, and we should have about 10 to 15 minutes at the end at a minimum to have a dialogue about this. I want this to be an introduction or to my research, but also see it as an invitation to think with you about possibilities of this work and how you see yourself in it, whether you're a graduate student or a professional from international backgrounds. My work has been speaking to that community that I have been part of, and I really hope to hear from you. So for today, um, I would be speaking about, not just about specific research projects. I want to speak about my own kind of larger research agenda around international and internationalization of higher education. And it's kind of personal. It's personal in the way that I came from a different background to higher ed. My background was in engineering, and from 2015, I came to study higher education. And I had continuously been thinking and have had this dilemma. What does it mean to be an international person in the field? What does that international person signify? But how does it bear? And how do I show up in spaces? How do I do research? And what does that mean? So I would get really deep into that question. But to highlight that and the importance of it, it's also a paper that I'm working on, and hopefully I can at some point finish it. I would be weaving my personal narrative and some of the research I have done to show why that question matters. And as I do that, I want to highlight the how of research and the who of research. Who speaks and how do they speak matters, and thinking about what does it mean to do research with international students, which is also a network I will talk about at the end, and kind of talk about the implications and hearing again from you all at the end in the Q&A time. So the very basic question, and I would kind of expand on it with some examples as we move on, is this question of what is an international standpoint in research? So to begin with, and I would get to talk about what does a standpoint and a standpoint theory mean, but I would kind of think as a very basic way, a standpoint means as perspective, right? I think a lot of you are in education, you probably have heard the word positionality, your identities, your socialization, your background, your life story, all of the things that make you who you are, and that who you are bears on what you see and how you see the world, right? It's the epistemology, it's the positionality of how doing the research. And my question is like, what does international mean in that? Is that we're just from outside the United States? What does that even mean? And you might have heard that there is more and more research, and people are saying, even in research on international students or international scholars, we will need to expand the idea of what we mean by international. So there's some conversation around that to say, to our international students, I think the most common thing that comes to mind is like if one student who are immigrant on a non-immigrant visa, on a student visa, but the reality is that there's just a lot more in that category. It could be immigrants, it could be second generations, it could be people who come as refugees. So it's really an expanded category. And even from international itself, there are people from all kinds of countries of origins, racial background, gender. It's just so many things that we pack into that idea of international. And if that in itself is complicated and people think about who fits into that, I want to expand that conversation and think about how those categories come to bear on knowledge production, whether it's teaching or research. So I'll give some examples with some also personal narratives. I come from Iran, so I came to the US to study, to start my studies in as a master's and PhD back in like 13, 14 years ago. And the first time that I came to the field, I was kind of curious about, what does international higher education look like, research on it. And I was really quickly realized that one pathway for me is that to be an Iranian international student who would be basically studying Iranian higher education. I think that's the most straightforward path for a lot of international students. They need to kind of be pushed into these categories of they would speak about their own countries of origin, that system, and study that if they want to do international research. And I was really not interested in that. Not that I didn't care about Iranian higher ed. I wanted to have an expanded perspective of higher education itself internationally. And so I started to focus about the US higher education and have, for the most part, been studying US higher education. So I got around my dissertation years, and one of my advisors, Cassie Barnhart, a wonderful person at the University of Iowa, and she had started some project at Kosovo, and she would say that she does international research, right? She's an American person who's studying Kosovo and the relationship between Kosovo and U.S. higher education partnerships. And she usually posed at me like, this question of, are you doing international research? And I was like, well, if an American person can study Kosovo and become international research, doesn't me being an international person studying United States mean that I do international research? Like, isn't that the same logic? Why should I define whether I do international research? And what does it mean? Does it mean studying from an international perspective? Does it mean is studying the context between nations? Does it mean studying as an outsider of another country? So it's always like there's all these questions that are packed into some of the words that we use. And I have different combinations of things on the slide to think about all kinds of possibilities about, what does international research mean or can look like potentially. But that question has always been with me. What does it mean to do international research? What does international standpoint mean? So I use the word standpoint versus positionality, and I think that differentiation really matters to me. Um, the word standpoint comes from feminist theory. It's from Sandra Harding, who with Donna Haraway, some of the early scholars in feminist thought and science studies, were really questioning what does a woman perspective in the field of sciences and engineering look like? What do women bear on the knowledge production? And a lot of my work sits with that question from feminist thought, but also transnational feminism, which has been much more thinking about some of this question. And for them, the perspective alone is not the thing. It's about what the perspective does. So I love this quote in that it says, only through struggles can we begin to see beneath the appearances created by an unjust social order to the reality of how this social order is in fact constructed and maintained. Excuse me. This need for struggle emphasizes the fact that the feminist standpoint is not something that anyone can have simply by claiming it. It's an achievement. A standpoint differs in this respect from a perspective which anyone can simply have by opening one's eye. And I think that really matters. And I'm hoping to show what I mean by that as I talk about some of these research examples. I'm really thinking, can the international bear on the knowledge production, not just because a person can claim that identity and say, I'm an international person, hence I have something to add, but what does it mean to actually add when that addition is starting to see these systems that create social orders or unjust social orders and can actually bear witness to it and try to critique and transform it, which is really what I mean when I think of international standpoint, and how more or less unconsciously, I've been kind of always trying to push on that. I was always trying to name these realities. So the first example was my dissertation. I really don't want anybody to go and read my dissertation necessarily. I'm not, I'm like, it's just there. I don't want to bring attention to it. But it was also the first time that I actually kind of engaged with this question. I was doing my dissertation at the time of COVID-19 pandemic. It wasn't fun. It just, how it was, you had to do it. And I was like, now that there is a COVID-19 pandemic and a lot of things are difficult to do, let me actually study the pandemic itself. And I was fascinated by so many dynamics happening at the beginning of the pandemic. And I was really curious about this construct of belonging, which is so central to US higher education, in terms of retention, in terms of student experiences, student efforts. It's a huge term, and there's so much packed into it. Everybody should belong. That's the ultimate goal in the field. It would increase retention, it would increase outcomes, it would improve experiences, it would shift racism. It's just like this magical formula, right? And I'm not saying that I'm against it. It's actually, there is a lot of truth and a lot of value in that kind of research. I was really curious about how this conversation around belonging unmasks how unbelonging starts to grow, what makes people not to belong to begin with. So kind of shifting the discourse into these questions of systems and structures that create unbelonging to begin with. And then I was starting to think, how do I speak to these concepts as a person from Iran? What does that mean? And I have a rather large paragraph on my dissertation. I would read parts of it as I speak around it too at the same time. And I'm kind of explain how I kind of approached it at the time. So early in my dissertation, I asked this question of what does it mean to belong, right? And then I said, being an international student in the United States, speaking and writing in a second language, living in an unfamiliar culture, are among many ways that at times I come to feel out of place. Belonging thus can be thought as a cartography where identity interacts with the space. Who and where one is are intertwined. However, this doesn't presume, said quotation from Sir Ahmed, the subject as originary, the container of a space rather than contained by the space. So I was starting to think that the space making and self making are co-constituted. Identity can be a home can be an identity. Uh, but the part that really matters is this next line, which really bears to that question of who I am as an international person. I was observing something. I was starting to think if you want to find out who you are in the United States, you have to have some potential understanding of a space, right? If I'm feeling out of a space, then what is the space that I'm feeling out of? So this line says cartographic activities, however, required absolute origins, the equator, the prime meridian, the north and south poles. As an Iranian man, hyper visible in the US media narrative and the Western imaginary as a pre-modern subject, I also come to feel out of time, living in the quote unquote the modern part of the world, out of the time of the out of place at a certain time and at a certain place hints at the social construction of a space and time. Where I'm here, it's not just a geography. That geography means something. It puts something on me. It makes me a certain subject just for being in here. And that being here, I can see it because of my perspective as an international person from Iran. I can actually notice how I can become to be out of place. How does a structure put me out of place? So they say if London time or absolute geographic coordinates serve as an indication bodies out of place and out of time inhabit the space-time of the white man, the space-time of race and coloniality, the grid on which identity lines cross and intersect. For those who are given a place on the grid, but who feel out of place, questions of belonging are processes of orientation in the space-time of race and coloniality. So I was kind of setting up myself to think about how do I study in the United States this question, where every time I think of belonging, I'm automatically trying to think of colonization and decolonization, of racism and anti-racism, because whatever I do in this space, it's either going to be in this direction or that direction. What I do matters as a production of knowledge. So I think, you can kind of see in this example, this larger question of what I'm raising. I was trying to speak to the field about some of this question because of where I come from as an international person, as an Iranian, and trying to hold those as a way of looking back and producing knowledge. So it's kind of like introducing the idea. In my chapter 5, I had this idea at the time. I thought it was smart. Now again, I'm like not real sure, but it's what it is. But in my chapter 5, as I was working on implications, I was also having these personal narratives that I called intermezzos, and I inserted into my writing. And I would like to read one of that as another example of me in my dissertation trying to raise this question of what does belonging mean, not just into thinking how belonging matters, but what belonging does when we think of, belonging in this space. And at the time of the COVID-19 pandemic, which was the focus of my dissertation. So it's organized from right to left, which is how Persian is done. So I had these intermezzos from right to left within my dissertation. So that's why you look at it and it looks a little bit weird. And it's a personal note in the middle of my dissertation, which, I always find it fascinating. And my committee was kind of struck by it. It's about the COVID-19 time and my own experience of it. I noted the meetings were getting delayed, postponed, canceled. People were rearranging their lives and social relations. Many of my friends who were always on top of everything were now starting to forget details and fail to accomplish their goals. Some were pondering what it means not to go to see their friends and family for a while. And as I was watching this all unfold, for a moment, I felt I finally belonged with them in crisis. They had arrived, even though they soon left again. But for a moment, we were in it together in the uncertainty of the moment, the cognitive affective overload, the forced separation and isolation, a state of perpetual mental fatigue. We were not the same by any measure. The virus did not equalize, but for me, and I assume for many others, always living in crisis brought a moment of clarity. We were ready because we have always been living in the future, which is the ruins of capitalism, racism, and settler colonialism. And I was raising this question, which still matters to me. What life-giving higher education is possible in the unfolding ruins of capitalism, racism, and coloniality? To me, that kind of captures my standpoint. So as part of my research in the US have been involved, studying basic needs and security in college. So I am doing data collection right now with the students who are experiencing housing and food insecurity. And that's how I approach my research. Instead of trying to see how we can fix them into the system, I ask myself, well, it's probably not going to get better. Even as we go, we see the inflation is going higher, which is the nature of capitalism to me. More and more people are getting more poor. And if anything, I feel like I understand how that works. The kind of perspective I can bring to the table is reshifting and thinking with these students about what does it mean to live well? What does higher education mean in this moment in people's lives? When these things are getting more and more normal, rather than we are getting away from it, if anything, things are getting worse. I wish it wasn't. And I wish I thought that would be different, but I'm not that optimistic generally, given how I situate my work within these structures of, capitalism and racism. So, back to that question again, it's kind of seeing a standpoint not as just a mere identity or this positionality in the way that sometimes people simplify it, but really putting the historical, geographic, temporal, cultural, social into working of examining ideas, concepts, constructs. What does it mean to, investigate this idea of belonging? That kind of the picture of the home is supposed to mean. But kind of like to me, there is this question, and that's my invitation for other folks who come from international backgrounds, is kind of thinking, how can we bear witness and bring our knowledge and perspective to question? And it doesn't always have to be questioning means to negating, but to complicating understandings of some of these concepts. And as I mentioned it, I'm reminded that I'm hoping that this conversation can be useful both from folks from international backgrounds, but also folks working with folks from international backgrounds. So there is something in it for everybody to think of. Um, and this kind of brings me from the research that I was doing as an individual to kind of the research I was doing with other international folks or folks coming from international backgrounds, and kind of comes with this question of what does it mean to research with, as this reorientation to think about epistemic justice or epistemic injustice, which to me is basically whose voices are heard and whose voices are not heard during different kinds of processes. And I would kind of come back to that question at the end. Um, so one of the papers that I did a few years ago when I was finishing my PhD studies, and one of my wonderful friends, Elmira Jangju, who's now a senior research analyst at IFACA SNR, she was also a student at the time, and we didn't start talking for the research. We were actually both from Iranian backgrounds, and at some point we were talking to each other about our experiences about the programs, and then later came to write it as part of this a special issue, which was organized, actually shout out to previous faculty and residents at the Commission for Graduate for Global Dimensions, who were Katie Cook, Krishna Bisna, and Mariana Sharif, and the three of them were organizing this special issue, which has been wonderful. And we wrote this article in it. The article was basically coming from some of the conversation we had for a while about how we experience classrooms, which is, one of the places that some of you who might be graduate students might be experiencing when you go to different programs and thinking about whose voices are heard and how, and thinking about centering our own experiences to speak to these larger structures. So I have this line in here, which I think kind of captures the problem and the idea we were exploring. Um, so Milad and Elmira, the two of us were using our individual vignettes to kind of our stories to describe how we each defined and understood silence, experienced it, and made sense of it. We started a dialogue with an individual account of classes in our PhD program, where a comment we shared was followed up with a longer than usual silence. Before the class conversation went back to what it was before we shared our comment. We felt confused. Were there other students pondering about the comment? Was it out of context or irrelevant? Was it too analytical, requiring extra process time? Were we not clear about what we were trying to communicate? Was our English pronunciation wrong or misleading? Were other people being nice to us because what we said was simply wrong? Why wouldn't they ask a follow-up question to clarify a point? So that was really the starting point, these silences that we experienced. And we kind of didn't want to dehumanize other people for doing it. In fact, in the paper, we talk about how sometimes we did that to other people. And at the same time, we were starting to think, what does this silence contain? What does it say about the social structures, the society we live in, the society where we are being educated? In that sometimes we would share something about Iran, our experiences, and it just wasn't taken up in the classroom. Again, it's not questioning the people, but questioning the structures. What gets to count as knowledge? How does it come to bear in these discussions or doesn't come to bear in our discussions? And I think about that now as a faculty who have international students in my classroom, and sometimes they would share something, and sometimes I think about my own work and I'm like, oh gosh, I don't know how to include it in the conversation. Because sometimes the conversation itself is so US centric or so specifically around these conversations that are happening in the United States, that it makes it more difficult to include these perspectives in the classroom. And I'm aware of that because I was actually doing the work to start to question how can we expand or create a space for these different ways of knowing and different knowledges to come and bear in our classrooms, in our conversation. And it matters because even as a faculty,
Those bags, those are
so now as a faculty, I even do think about how do I include more, readings from international perspectives, how do I engage the students so that we can include some of these different perspectives in our conversations about, let's say, college environments. College environments don't happen just in the United States. It happens in all countries. There is all kinds of different contexts written on it. But that kind of comes to question, what does internationalization of, for example, curriculum mean? How do we create a spaces where these different knowledges can become part of our conversation? And why does that come to matter? Um, Another work that I've done was a book chapter that I wrote with a few folks who come from international backgrounds and were in my program at the University of Nebraska Lincoln. I would shout out to Pashali Saha, who's now a PhD student at University of Missouri Columbia, True Nguyen, who's a PhD student at University of South Carolina, Chulpan Kalandarova, who's now working at Minnesota, and Julius Owusu Afriye, who is working at the University of Nebraska Lincoln. And they have now are professionals or, doing PhD, amazing PhD work. And at the time we were coming together to think about curriculum, right? I was building up on the work I had done on the silence to think about what does it mean to include professional international voices. And one of the questions we were raising, and it was just fascinating in the conversation we were having, is that what does it mean to be an international professional? What does international mean? Again, you see this me coming back to this central question in a lot of work I do, which is what is international? What does it add to the conversation? What does that add to the idea of a professional in the United States? And of course, it matters in the sense that, in HISA programs, and we were using HISA programs as an example of ourselves, but kind of apply the idea to professionals from other fields. There are professional nurses, there are professional medical professionals, there are professional lawyers, social workers who come from international backgrounds. And again, we were talking about what does international mean? Most of these fields have a set of standards or competencies around what counts or who gets to count as in professional, what kind of knowledge is required for that. And most of that are very national centric. And I don't mean it in a bad way. It's just like, a person who's being trained in the United States to work in the United States need to understand certain competencies and skills that are US centric. So not questioning that part per se, but really thinking, then what are we doing here? Are we just adding to it? Are there ways to actually transform these perspectives? Like, what does the international do to this context? And I have a comment here from one of us in the team who shared, it wasn't me, it was one of the students at the time, not professionals. We have the tools in the higher ed system, but it doesn't mean that international professionals work alone by themselves because we cannot change the whole system by ourselves. We need to work with American professionals or even American faculty. Because from my experience, like we try to share our experience and try to educate other people, but the way we share with the American people, it seems that they don't follow and they don't listen to our voice. So again, you kind of see that epistemic injustice side, that people share something, but it's not necessarily picked up. It's not always listened to. And that doesn't always just apply to people from international backgrounds. You hear that the same ideas from people who come from different marginalized identities whose ideas are not taken up in the field. Um, so we together we're talking about these questions of what does again professional international mean? Is the professional international by default, or is it just who you are as an international that gets added to the word professional? Like, are you an international US professional or are you an international professional? So I think these are just like dilemmas that was emerging in our conversation. And we were saying that we're training us to be international American and not international for any other place. Like we are not being trained to be international and work in other countries' higher ed systems per se. And I love this quote because I think to me captures the essence of this. One of us shared, again, not me, one of the students was sharing, we are training you in our system by adding your touch. That's like the plain truth of it. Like we are giving you these skills, which only works with our system, but we just need a little but we need just a little bit of your perspective to add to it. So you see that part, which to me, it also captures so much of the critiques of DEI when people are brought to the table, they're asked to bring their perspectives to the table, but people don't want anybody to question the table or the structure of the table or changing of the table. And I think that's where the pushback comes in. And you see that a little bit in our own conversation on international professional. The moment people wanted to share things that was questioning the very structure of our work, then there is more pushback or it gets silenced more often than not. So that was another example. And the final example I would share before I wrap up, and I would hope that you would have perspectives and we can have some dialogue around this. Was that a chapter that I recently published with, again, some of the students and some of the alumni from my program that I have got to know from the Commission for Global Dimensions. And again, why I think the Commission is more than just a place where people meet, it can become a site of knowledge production, which is why it really matters. And as much as in ACPA, we get so many awards every year or so many accomplishments of the Commission, I think the truly transformative work is where it happens when people come together and name things and add this perspective and share our standpoint and speak back to the field. And these are some examples of it. So I did this chapter with Yijun Tay, who works at the University of California in Berkeley, Karen Gunalan, who works at the University of Toledo, and Eva Fefsosu, who was at the time at the University of Nebraska Lincoln and now works at Texas. And we were talking about, what does mentorship means beyond borders and thinking about the contrast spaces. We were working as professionals from international backgrounds. And again, I would read just this one short sentence. As I wrap up, by focusing on our experiences as graduate students, professionals, and early career faculty from international backgrounds, we highlight the ways our liminal positionality gives us an opportunity to think about what does mentorship mean, what mentorship means, and can look like for those wanting to deconstruct current systems and humanize higher education. And I think that to me was the reason I was working with these beautiful, wonderful souls who are super smart to think about, how can we center our knowledge and look back at the field and say, here's how we can do things better. Here's how we can do things differently. And I think that to me has always been part of bearing that international standpoint to, to come and speak to the field. So yeah, I've heard me probably say this 100 times now. How do we listen and research with international students, scholars, and practitioners, and what did it mean to include international standpoints? To me, the idea of researching with really matters. There's actually a network that has started a couple of years ago, researching with international students. It's out of UK with Jenna Mittelmeier and a couple of other folks are doing wonderful work to really reframe international research to thinking about how do we center and include international perspectives and students, professionals, scholars, to be central to the, basically knowledge production research. And that's kind of, you see, part of my work. A lot of work I've done is writing and doing research with, which is collaborative autoethnographies, dual autoethnographies. And they really help us because since we are together, we can create a space where we can feel safe and we can listen to each other deeply. So I'm not just listening to pick up the parts that I resonates with me, but also pick up the parts that may be difficult for me to understand. And I think that has been central for me to doing research with these folks because they really help me to name realities and we can actually have these standpoints to become a site of knowledge production. As I leave you, I had a few of the implications from the chapter on mentorship that I thought actually would be a really good way of thinking about the implications of this talk that I'm giving, so that again, centering not just my perspective, but some of the folks that I have worked with. One, thinking about self-reflection on knowledge limits. All of us come from different backgrounds and national backgrounds. How do we think about that and use that and think what are the limits of knowledge because of where we come from? And how can we engage these different perspectives because people are coming from these diverse backgrounds with that difference that matters to this conversation being the international part specifically? What does it mean to incorporate international perspective? Did you just wanting to add to the table and just say, we are just going to hear the part you said, which is still aligns with what I believe to be right? Or can we actually get into deeper conversations if somebody shared something that can actually question some of even our canons. Like, again, I do a lot of work on basic needs and security, and I'm like, there are people who are coming from contexts of the world, post-colonial contexts that are much more in poverty, and the students are in poverty. I don't mean it in a bad way. They are in poverty because of colonialism. It's not a measure of who they are. But because of that, they can actually have knowledge to contribute in the United States to how to engage poverty in higher education. But again, sometimes in higher education in the United States, people don't want to assume that our poverty is, similar to other poverty areas. And the reality is that it is kind of in the same continuum for so many different reasons. And of course, it's complex. So I don't want to simplify it, these different perspectives. But my point is that I think there is something to be added to our field that can actually shift our field and how we study some of these phenomena if we actually were able to allow these perspectives, these international standpoints to bear and add to the field and sometimes even critique it. Challenging the binary thinking about, this us versus them. I struggle with that. Sometimes when I say international, I automatically create this binary of international versus American. And I think that's just a poor way of thinking. Even for myself, I have to push myself out of it and think about how can we come across our differences to a study of a phenomena. The fact that I'm an international perspective doesn't mean that I automatically have some valued perspective and the American perspective is devalued. Rather than we have differences, and these differences need to be rigorously engaged to have more meaningful conversations about the constructs that our field is struggling with. And finally, the practical applications for graduate and professional education. How do we do that in our curriculum? How do we do that in our research? How do we do that in the conferences we go to? So that's really my invitation. And with that, right at 35 minutes, I want to stop here and I'm really hoping to have and hear what resonated with you, what kinds of questions it's raising for you. If you have doubts, if you have pushbacks, it's more than welcome to say if there's parts of it you disagree with. I would actually welcome that. And I would pass it back to Dr. Brines for the facilitation.
Thank you, Malad. First, let's give Malad a round of applause for his great presentation. I know it's hard. There's like a sea of no faces, so it's always funny. Oh, there we go. We got some claps. Yay. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Um, One of the things, Malad, that I was thinking about when you were talking, and this actually, I started to type the question in, and then you totally, it was like a perfect segue for this, is when you mentioned about the international versus the US centric, like how your mind automatically goes to that. And as a faculty member in a HESA program, right, and I've seen an increase in our international students that are, applying to these programs that are in my courses and things like that. And so I'm going to put this question in here, but, what does it look like to treat international knowledge, especially when we're creating like assignments and papers and readings, like to be foundational is equally foundational and not supplementary, right? Like, what do you think that looks like? Or if anybody wants to talk about that, here, I put the question in the chat. But I feel like we need to retrain our minds almost, or really sit with like, how do we make this more intentional or more organic or more natural? Does that make sense?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And I think it's just such a big question. I can share some of the things I've done, and I would honestly say I don't think I have still succeeded at it. Like even in my own classrooms, where there is like a majority international students, I still struggle with that. I've done a couple of things though. One thing that I've done, I teach a course on college environments. Now I've done it twice in the student affairs program, and and it's funny, still the theoretical basis of the work is rather US centric. So we read the Strange and Banning. So it's kind of like that sets the foundations, and we read the student success theories, which are coming from the US context. But for the second half of the semester, almost all of the readings are from international context. So for example, students would read about the experience of multilingual learners in Dubai. And in fact, I didn't have any student coming from Middle East or Dubai, but it kind of like puts a further space perspective into the classroom, and it helps both American students to think about contexts which are not particularly separate from United States. There are multilingual learners in the United States, in lots of spaces of United States. And then there are international students who are experiencing it in different way in the United States. And then we can all kind of talk about this piece that's about Dubai and the Gulf countries and how these Gulf countries are, having these difficulties where English is a central language. It's shifting their own cultural norms, but they also want to become part of international higher ed. So we have sometimes some good, robust conversations when we are having these different contexts. And that's been one of the things that I've done that I feel like it has helped shift some of how we engage in the classroom. That said, I think a lot of international students, even with me being in the classroom and come from international backgrounds myself, I think they are still very cautious about sharing about their own international perspectives in the classroom. And I don't really know still how to create the shift. And granted, they come to my classroom in the second year of the program, so they have already been socialized for 1 year. And I think some of that might come to carry because they are not sure about what to share anymore or what feels right to share. Um, so I think to me, it's kind of like at least I think what we can do is intentionally disrupting uh, these kinds of like the readings we assign and the kind of conversation we assign so that we can help people come into the conversation and create a structure where people can be feeling a little bit more safer to engage in it. So I do ungrading, which kind of takes the burden away from the I have to say the right thing to get the grade. But again, I feel like even with that, I'm not really sure I have changed the larger structure. I think I still really struggle with how to help people feel safe. And I would say the other part related to that, I have international students who have worked in their own countries. They have been to other countries other than United States and their own country before coming to the United States. And I'm like, God, you have such a wealth of knowledge, and I want to hear that. And it usually doesn't come into the classroom. I think they post a little bit more on the asynchronous side. So I have the Canvas website, and sometimes I hear that in what they write and share on the Canvas website versus the classroom. But to me, it's so systemic that it's so hard to disrupt. And I really want to say, you know so much. You actually might know even more than I know. Please bring that to the classroom. And I invite that. I say that openly. Um, I think it might have made some dents and at least maybe shifted and disrupted the dynamics a little bit, but I wouldn't say it has been successful.
I wonder if would be if it would be helpful to invite, some of those perspectives or standpoints, right, into like the actual design, like before class starts, right, into that whole
Mm,
curriculum design piece, like, hey, I want to make sure that this class it again, right, is it's not just a supplementary piece and I'm intertwining it into all of this, like help me kind of look at my assignments or look at my readings or what can I do? Like what's your thought? What are your thoughts on that? And being more intentional in that way instead of kind of an afterthought or when it's almost too late, because we know as faculty, right? Like if the semester's getting ready to start, we're like, oh no, we got to get the syllabus done. And I'm not always as good about with time management as I want to be, but maybe being more intentional about trying to do that ahead of time. So,
mhm,
that that
mhm.
that might be helpful. I'm not sure.
I love I love that, Julie. I almost feel called out, but also it's such a no-brainer and such a, I think, good answer to one way to do it. And when I talk about epistemic justice, I think it makes a lot of sense. And as you said, part of me really hates it because I would be like, I'm probably doing my syllabus a week before the class. But, I think being intentional and actually engaging those perspectives before it's actually such a really good perspective. I appreciate that. Also, know a lot of people have their cameras off. Feel free to put into the chat box. If you don't want to be the person talking, you can put it into the private question to Julie and she can ask me. But, um, the good thing is that you don't have to sound as smart. I just wonder like what resonated. If there are parts that you have questions about, any of those thoughts are welcome.
Yes, please feel free to ask questions. Um, Something else that I was thinking about too when you were talking earlier is, as a colleague, right, and a professor of international students and a colleague, how can we create environments where others are not feeling overlooked or silenced? Are there are some things that we can do, if we hear something or like it's a cultural thing, I think too, right? Like how can we like what can we do to push back against that or be supportive?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's really hard. I'll give an example. Half confession. I had a guest speaker a couple of years back come to my class, and we were talking about this piece about carcerality and trans students. And one of my international students asked the question about like, the legal landscape around, LGBTQ populations in the United States. And I remember I didn't give a space to the question. Part of my brain immediately was like, that's not immediately relevant to the conversation. People kind of know it from other classrooms. And the guest speaker kind of answered, but didn't get into deep into it because that wasn't immediately relevant to the reading. And after I went home and I thought to myself, and I was like, on all the ways that I say include voices, what if I had actually given a space in the classroom to talk about that? Do I assume American students know about the legal and historical landscape? Did I assume that it's only the international students who do not know? And I think, the moment I started to think about that, it was the moment I realized I'm probably just making assumptions, and that I'm also acting on my own stereotypes or ways that I feel comfortable with because there's a guest speaker and I'm trying to be engaged in the classroom in this deeper conversation. But really, why wouldn't I take a question that might seem a little bit obvious, but at the same time, maybe it's not obvious. Maybe that's where we need to go. So for me, one thing that I have done, which is really hard, is that sometimes I have to sit with myself and say, was that the best choice I made? And I actually reached out to that student. I had a conversation and they said, yeah, that kind of sucked. You did that. And I actually didn't feel good about what you did. And we had a good conversation about it. I had to apologize, which is fine. We all make mistakes. And I was fine saying, I don't think that was the best approach. And we had a good conversation about what does it mean for the classroom, similar to what you're saying. And I think that's really, to me, the central idea is that listening means we have to sit with the discomfort of the fact that some of the ways and how we do things might actually not be the best, and learning from that perspective. And for me, it also pushes me to say and think, I come from international perspective, but it doesn't mean I know the international perspective. I can still have my own biases or parts that I can grow and become better at. So I think that's the one thing that comes to my mind, at least something personally for me, to sometimes actually be able to sit with the uncomfortable feeling of that was not the best move. Maybe I need to talk and with the student about what worked or what didn't and get their perspective and have that perspective actually shift my own practice.
I love that you said that, especially about the assumptions piece. I was teaching my legal class last night, right? And we talked about assumptions and the danger that there can be from us making those, and how just even asking like there's nothing wrong with asking questions and
Mhm,
trying to find out more information and admitting we don't know answers and and also we talked about, being vulnerable, right?
mhm,
And what you described about that experience with a student, I've had those moments myself where I've gone back and been like, oh, I did not like how I responded to that. I did not like how I answered that or how I handled it. And it's not easy to go back and kind of admit that. But I did the same thing, right? I
mhm,
talked about it in class the next time, or I reached out to that
mhm,
person to be like, I wanted to bring back this back because I wasn't happy with like how I answered this question or how I handled this. And I really went
mhm,
back and thought about it because just like our students, we're learning too, we're with them,
mhm,
right? And so I really like
mhm,
that whole, yes, we can't make assumptions. And of course, I'm like, what does an assumption do? It makes a, out of you and whatever. And when my students, it's like they talk about that. And we make a lot of assumptions about things and we just need to ask questions. It looks like Elizabeth said, I think it's also important to remember that this feeling of being overlooked frequently happens outside of the classroom as well. For example, in responses from those of us that are here to support students' overall experience. I like that your research
mhm.
considers that as well.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I come and think mostly about as a faculty thinking about research and teaching, but that's really a professional practice too. If you're professionals working with people from international backgrounds, I mean, it's to me what it centers is learning more so than the overall work project. It's like how do we learn in these groups together? And I have, for example, a student who comes from an international background and works in an international office in in another state, and had mentioned, for example, that they have been mentioning how refugees are not part of the conversation, and it didn't go well in the conversation they had in their office. But again, it's kind of like, once you come from those backgrounds, sometimes you see things that other people might not immediately see. And I feel like it's even so much in our professional practices, or people have worked in these other countries and they might be like, sure, some of this stuff look really good in what we do, but have you ever considered X, which might be coming from the experiences from their country or from another country they have worked in? And I think it would be good for all of us as a practice to be able to at least consider things and think about what if, that what if doesn't have to mean that we have to say yes to other people, but I think the what if is an invitation to imagine differently. And I think that's what I hope for myself and for everybody, to engage these otherwise imaginations of what might be possible. That's a really good comment, though, Elizabeth. Thank you for that.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, well, it looks like we are coming to a close on our time. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen again so I can we can share information about our open positions. And then was Min Young going to talk about that? Or do you want me to do that, Lixing? Let me share it really quick.
Yeah, you can go ahead to
Okay.
share.
All right. Okay, so as I mentioned earlier, we do have several vacant positions on our directorate board. We have 2 faculty and residents elect, 2 vice chairs for educational programs, 1 vice chair for awards and scholarships, 2 podcast and blog editors, 2 vice chairs for marketing and member outreach, and member at large. And you can scan our QR code. And Lixing, if you have a chance to put that link in the chat again for the application, that would be
Yes,
great.
it's
Thank
already
you.
shared in the
All right.
chat.
Perfect.
Thanks.
I know sometimes when people come in, they don't see previous links and things like that. So just a little bit more information. We want to remind you that we're not done, right? This is our first session, but we have 3 more, and our next one is next Friday at the same time. It's called Resilience and Critical Hope as Strategies for Navigating Instability. We hope that you'll consider joining us again next week and for our other 2 as well. Here's some information for you too. If you attend 3 out of the 4 sessions for our colloquium, you will be able to receive a certificate of completion. You need to fill out the certificate sign-up sheet by Wednesday, May 6th. You can wait to do that until then, until close to that time, but here is the link and there's a QR code. I think we'll also be sharing the link again when we towards the end, we'll share that with all the participants just in case they didn't get that. But it's just a quick form to fill out to let us know that you've attended the different sessions. And I think that is all for there. Any other last minute comments or notes or thoughts? Thank you. Yes, thank you everyone for attending. Thank you to Malad for your wonderful presentation. And again, please join us in the future for our next few sessions. But I think that wraps us up.
Thank you all for attending, and thank you for the facilitation, Julie.